Hi, my name is Dan Gomez, and this is Mental Health Super Omnia. Mental health above all. We identify and understand mental health issues and the paths for help. Today, we want to talk about anxiety, in particular, the impact on both the parents and the child. We have with us two returning guests. First, Jackie Corcoran. Jackie has over 30 years experience. She's currently director of the Doctorate in Clinical Social Work program at Penn's School of Social Policy and Practice. She's written 18 books and over 100 journal articles and book chapters. Her areas of scholarship include adult and youth mental health. We also have Erica Burgoon. Erica is a member of the leadership team at Equilibria and a licensed clinical psychologist with over 25 years of experience. She provides clinical services across the lifespan and specializes in working with depression, anxiety, and trauma. Jackie wrote an insightful, instructive, and a very helpful book, Your Child's Mental Health Diagnosis, a comprehensive and compassionate guide for parents. Highly recommended. Jackie, let me ask the first question here. The problem I have with anxiety, using a word like anxiety, is that it's a commonly used word. I may be using it appropriately, I may be using it inappropriately, but I'm not always using it from a perspective of clinical diagnosis. So can you summarize what a parent sees when their child has diagnosable anxiety? And what's the impact on both the child and the parent?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question because it is a term that's widely used today and sometimes misused when it is used.
Sure.
And so it has kind of fuzzied the lines. I mean, the good news about that is that there's just been much more awareness of anxiety than there used to be. You know, both Eric and I was just noting that both of us have been around for a while doing this. And so over time, you know, that time period has been when anxiety has come out as a problem that can be treated. But there's a few things that define a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. And one is the pervasiveness of it. You know, it's not just a fleeting thing in reaction to something they've just seen and are getting silly about something. I mean, it's like they're freaking out as if, you know, a tiger is approaching them. You know, so just the intensity of the feelings, the pervasiveness of that, and then also it's a length of time. You know, and each anxiety disorder has its own specified length of time, but it's not a trivial length of time. Like it's gone on for a while, it's been pretty stable. And then the other thing is just the impact on the child, the family, and the functioning all around, particularly school and peers. And, you know, if there's a real toll in the family, like now their lives are revolving around this child's anxiety, or they're just so angry and frustrated at their child because of it. So it's causing some conflict in the household and sort of disrupting things as well. So those are a lot of criteria to meet to make it actually a clinical diagnosable disorder, as well as an array of symptoms that the child has to show, again, which differ per diagnosis.
Yeah, I really am so glad we're here to talk about this today, Jackie, because as you said, I think anxiety has been garnering much more attention, and it's been something that really is on a lot of parents' minds. There's a lot of books out there now speaking to just growing anxiety among children and adolescents. And as Dan said, anxiety is a universal human experience. We can't expect to avoid all anxiety. In fact, anxiety, as we know, can help us to survive and thrive. But I appreciate you distinguishing what it might look like when anxiety reaches clinical levels that is really impacting a child's quality of life and their parents and family. Because as you said, oftentimes the family starts to organize around the anxious child. So I'm thinking when a parent starts to recognize that their child's anxiety may be more than might be typical or typical discomforts that come with childhood, what are some first steps that they can consider to support and help their child?
Well, I guess, talking to them first, trying to find out more information from the child. And, depending on the child, there'll be a lot of different kinds of reactions to that. But, some children, I think a lot of children are going to be relieved that their parent is willing to sit down and talk to them about the specifics of this. Because usually as parents, we jump to reassurance seeking, we jump to advice giving, just to kind of move the things along that we have to do every day. So that child might not have had an opportunity to really express themselves, perhaps. And, perhaps there's specific things that they're worried about that, you can help them with. So that's valuable information. And a good question to ask, I'm getting very concrete here, but when parents ask, what's the worst thing about this? Or what's the scariest thing about this? Or whatever, that people are kind of relieved to actually verbalize that. And kids, just have the difficulty in not being able to really express themselves always verbally. They just don't have the words and the awareness sometimes. So a parent who can help them do that, I think is a good first step for sure.
Yes, I really appreciate the advice for open-ended questions and listening. I say this with such a hefty dose of compassion towards parents, but because most of us live such busy lives, sometimes when we are faced with a problem, we look for the most efficient solution, which might feel like, as you said, advice giving, or, those yes and no questions to let's just try to address this as quickly as we can. We can learn a lot by listening to our kids. And I think that question, what's the worst case you're imagining, can tell us a lot about what's on our kids' minds.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So I recognize, as a parent, almost all parents, we want to love, we want to care for our children, we want to protect them. But oftentimes I recognize, again, both as a parent and in my clinical work, sometimes that desire to protect might lead us to address our kids' anxiety or respond to their anxiety in ways that ultimately might not be very helpful. And I can think of a few things, but one of the things that's on my mind is families who kind of organize around protecting the child from having to experience anxiety and maybe collude in avoidance. So families who are picking up their children routinely from school because they're having some school avoidance, or not having them go to school at all, or families who are organizing their lives so that the child never has to be separated from the parent, for kids who have separation anxiety. So I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to that experience of parents who may respond that way to a child who's anxious.
Right. It's a typical response, as you're saying. We've definitely seen it. And there's a term in the anxiety treatment. It's called accommodation. And it's kind of like enabling, which, you started to describe as you were going on, that someone's sort of enabling the anxiety continue by organizing their lives around it and accommodating to the child's need because they're in such distress. I mean, the parent comes from usually a very well-intentioned place, like who wants to see their child suffering. So, but it's well-intentioned, but it also isn't helpful in getting a child to recover from a diagnosis like this. So, you had asked me before about what steps to take, and I said about just talking to your child. But one, I think, is also recognizing when, the pattern of the family has just gotten to the point where it's pretty entrenched. And so at that point, I think, and sometimes outside help can be good in, entertaining a new view and starting to, get some new patterns going where the child is being reinforced for being able to do things that are age appropriate and facing some of the discomfort of that. And then also dealing with what has to be some, at least, parental anxiety over whatever it is, performance or, if you can't tolerate your child's experience, that's kind of like that's might be your issue to deal with. So, sometimes outside help can be both for the child, but the parent is involved, and often the parent is involved in treatment, especially when children are younger, but to varying degrees as children are older as well.
Jackie, it's interesting that you mentioned that every parent wants to try and help their child, and I think that that's true. They want the best for their child. That said, in preparing for today, I actually did talk to a family that has a diagnosed child with anxiety. And what struck me was that the mother understood, got it, did what she was supposed to do, or what people were telling her to do in order to help the child. I think the child was getting therapy. The father, on the other hand, very likable person, very kind of happy-go-lucky, driven in a certain way, happy-go-lucky in life in general, driven in work. Completely didn't understand this whole idea of anxiety because he was never anxious a day in his life. So there was just a complete misunderstanding or lack of understanding. That's a better word, better phrase, lack of understanding of what anxiety was. So when you have that happening in a household where you have one parent who, fundamentally is looking at the child saying, "What's wrong with you? And why don't you get over it?" And another parent that understands and a child that is anxious, what needs to happen in that environment?
Well, it's such a common occurrence where one parent has one approach to parenting and one parent has another totally different approach based on a variety of factors, their gender and their personality and just so many things. But there are often different parenting styles, just as, two people come together, but they come with a very separate, usually parenting history. I mean, that's the source of conflict in general, I think, but it often shows up when children have diagnoses, because then it might become even more stark. Like in the situation you're talking about, it sounds like the mother has a traditional role and does spend more time with the child, because you said he was very driven at work. So I'm assuming, long hours and doesn't spend as much time with the child. So, I mean, the good part about that is that the mother is pretty much the hands-on person for a good majority of time. So that person then can implement what's needed and can take an approach. And it's also the person that was vulnerable to being caught up in this anxiety, because, it's a very close bond and sometimes things get a little sticky. And so, any treatment can help kind of disentangle just some of that. Like, okay, the child really does have to do this for themselves. That's appropriate. And I need to kind of step back and let them do that and take pride in them doing that. So in that situation you're painting, I don't know if it have a huge amount of damage. And I would hope over time that, he would learn more about what's involved, that he would be open to hearing the child's and the mother's perspective of it. And, he's going to come across this problem in other contexts, probably like the work setting that he's in. He'll meet people there who have anxiety disorders. And, over time there can be learning about that.
Yeah, I think that actually has occurred. It's almost to your point about coming to a marriage or to a relationship where you have different parenting styles. In this particular case, it's almost as if they came from two different cultures. They didn't, but it's almost as if they came from two different cultures. Mm-hmm. So that you're sitting there like not even understanding where the other person is coming from, and he's moved a long way towards helping his child in that regard, but it's obviously taken a while. But in that environment, it's possible. What I'm hearing you say is it's possible for that parent, the parent that doesn't get it or that needs help in terms of helping their child, to go get therapy themselves so that they can learn tools and techniques, or perhaps even just read the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think the parent, like I said, will have involvement in the treatment oftentimes. So it doesn't need to be even separate because it's so caught up in what's going to help the child, that component probably will be a piece of the treatment. And like I said, way more so for a younger child because, they just can't kind of tolerate a one-on-one for very long usually. And then some children actually need to be seen individually to make that boundary clear of like, you can do this. And, we don't have to have your parent here to talk about it. We can develop a plan for how you're going to go forward. So there's just sort of different kinds of sessions, kind of co-joint sessions.
I often think of this with parents and working with children with anxiety is like yes and the yes is for parents to be able to validate and recognize to their child like this is really hard, this is really difficult for you, that's real. And we can forge a path forward so that you can do more of these things that are difficult.
Exactly. It is both. And I think that the yes and though is a hard balance for people to do. People may come from the perspective of they don't get it at all. Some people get incredibly angry or frustrated when they see a child acting like this. Like it just irritates them that it's so illogical and it doesn't make any sense. And they want their child to respond with logic and it's just not there. And so they might be just very, very frustrated. And then there's other parents where we've been talking about just don't want to see their child unhappy and will kind of give into it and do whatever needs to be done so the child feels okay.
Yeah. I actually think of both types of parents or both approaches as being people who don't want to see their child unhappy. And then in the one approach, it's like, use the logic. This isn't dangerous. You can do that. Just do it. And I think that parent really most likely wants to see their child thrive as well. As we're talking through this, I think it's one thing that's evident is that the response that parents have tend to have a lot to do with their own experience with anxiety, probably in childhood themselves and their experience with anxiety as in adulthood, and that really interacts with their child's level of anxiety and how they respond to it. So it sounds like it's pretty important for parents to do a check of themselves in situations when they have an anxious child to see where they might be coming from.
Yeah, and people have, it is something to check out because just both from hereditary and then from environmental perspective, yes, the parent's way of handling things surely will have an effect on the child. So yes, there has to be a piece of checking in of like, is this mine that I have to deal with, or or is it child's and I have to let them deal with it with support? Because that's what you were describing is that, you want to encourage your child to do this and say, I'll be here for support as needed. And I'll be here a lot in the beginning. And then we can figure out how it goes down the line, But it's with support. It's not like saying, get out there and do it,
Yeah. So often I find myself comparing this to other developmental milestones and developmental growth in kids, right? So like we don't shove a book in front of a kid and say, read, just figure it out. There's steps and there's support along the way. And that's true for, riding a bike or, most things that a child might accomplish. I know this can feel different to parents because they might see another child the same age as their child who, gets it or doesn't struggle with this thing. But if your child is struggling, as you said, the support and the gradual progression through steps will be important to expect that and be prepared to support that.
Yeah, exactly.
So we started to talk about treatment a little bit in what we've shared so far, but I was hoping that you could talk to us more about what types of treatments are available for childhood anxiety and what you would recommend that a parent look for if they're seeking treatment for their child's anxiety.
Well, I mean, whether it is the most effective treatment or whether it has just been the most researched treatment that's been found to be, sort of moderately successful, So that's why I suggest cognitive behavioral therapy,
Mhm.
just because, it does have a track record. It doesn't show phenomenal results compared against other conditions sometimes in the research, but it's way better than no treatment at all, for sure. And there's a lot of protocols developed, and I think, so that would always be my recommendation, although that is tough actually to find them. So you have to go to different websites that sort of specialize about this. Hopefully your doctor, they've become way more familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, so it's something that doctors talk about now. But on their referral list, though, they might have just people that they've gotten to know over the years. I found that doctors don't have on their list necessarily people who practice sort of the evidence-based treatment methods. So, so it does take some work, I think, to find a provider who gives this kind of treatment, and it's not just one component. Because I've just seen people sort of waste their time on things that haven't really helped their child.
Mhm.
And so we do have a track record for that. And then, the chief part of cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety is exposure, which means, a child has to be exposed to the fears that they have, which is something we've been talking about, although we haven't used that language before.
Mhm.
The idea is just that the child is going to keep going forward in tackling what the fears are, but in a safe and step-by-step and lots of supported way so that they can do it and be successful.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people listening have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. And I appreciate you starting to talk about some of what that consists of, which is the exposure element that's as the behavioral piece, right? If we think of a child who I mentioned separation anxiety before, screams and cries whenever mom has to run an errand, or, God forbid, has to, go to something longer, like a dinner, parent-teacher conference. And that screaming and crying is evidence of their anxiety. What might exposure look like for a child like that who's dealing with separation anxiety?
Well, just in general, some of the steps are to break down the steps toward the worst outcome. So first, tackle very small separations or practice separations. I'm just giving an example. So we might come up a list of, this is the worst thing. This is where the child really freaks out, if it's a longer event, let's say. And then you might start with just very minimal amounts of time based on the baseline, whatever kind of thing that's going on right now. And then, the child has a lot of say in this too, about the pacing of that and the smaller steps if needed. And, so they're a participant in this as well as the parent is. And then they would, in the session, do some of the techniques that they've already practiced, such as, relaxation and self-talk, like, this is okay, she's going to be back soon, teaching the child how to summon up self-talk in the moment and being able to calm themselves. And I've noticed with some children, like having some kind of object that connects them to their parent.
Mhm.
Sometimes that helps, in just having that kind of support there. So anyway, these are just examples of how you might proceed with a treatment like this for separation anxiety disorder.
Do me a favor, Jackie, and let's flip back to the parents. What struck me when I think about parent relationship, I sometimes think about, or sometimes read a lot about divorces and the rise of divorce, how many people get divorced. I was struck in your book by the fact that people who have children who have ADHD, severe ADHD, have a much higher divorce rate than average, if you will. Is that true with anxiety as well, or not nearly the same case?
I don't recall any research that's really addressed that. I haven't seen anything like that. I mean,
Okay.
maybe something has come out more recently, but no, it's because it's usually the kind of behaviors that are very acting out and very conflictual. I mean, those are harder to sort of manage than anxiety, which, that child is often, as well as being anxious, they can be pretty compliant in other ways and quiet. And so it's kind of a different picture. And so it's not as, it can be annoying or, this kind of a mesh kind of relationship, but it's not just the explosiveness of children that may have a diagnosis of ADHD or something like, conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder.
So, some good news there, perhaps. And yet, a few minutes ago, the three of us were speaking about how in two-parent families, you may have parents who are viewing the challenges very differently and approaching the challenges very differently. And when you were speaking about exposure for separation anxiety, Jackie, what was evident in what you were sharing is that treatment doesn't just, in CBT and exposure, treatment doesn't just happen in the therapy room and during the therapy hour. It sounds like parents will be asked to do a lot of practice with their child in between sessions. So that really seems to speak to the importance of viewing this as a team effort, hopefully in a two-parent household, having both parents involved.
Would be ideal. Yeah, definitely. Because in all CBT approaches, yes, but for this, yes, it's not going to just end in the session. The parent's going to kind of learn how to encourage the next step and for the child to go forward on what they've agreed upon. And so, yeah, the parent still has a pretty heavy role between the sessions. So I'm glad you brought that point out. Another reason for parent to have their time with the therapist too, so that they can get support in this, because it's not easy for sure to change a pattern like this.
Erica, you mentioned two-parent families in this particular light, but what happens with the one-parent family? They're already working. They're already just completely jammed up in terms of their time. Maybe they have multiple children and they have this one that has, we'll just call it a special need in terms of things that as a parent need to do or that the child needs help with relative to anxiety. How does that work? Just a single parent? What types of things are you recommending in that particular environment?
Well, I just think support is just so important of all kinds, hopefully, so there might not be a partner there, but, other family members, friends. I mean, just this person needs to be supported, I'll say herself, because that's the scenario you're painting, but it is incredibly hard to do all those things. And you're right that a child's anxiety disorder, amongst a lot of competing very heavy demands, might not be high priority amongst everything else. So there's only so much, So, support is really important. And, that's why a treatment component for them is important. But the time involved in even setting up appointments and going, a lot to deal with. And you can't expect, someone to do everything. It's just not possible.
With an older child, and even as a parent, if a parent were going alone, can that be done through telehealth?
Yeah, I think it can. I mean, we found some great adaptations for telehealth. And in general, what the research says is that, there's comparable outcomes to in-person. I mean, I don't personally prefer it, and I've just noticed anecdotally that providers don't like it, well, except for the convenience factors. They don't like I think that they would rather be in the room with a client in terms of just being able to kind of feel the vibe and understand some of the nuances that I think, can be lost over the screen. But clients seem very happy with it. And, it produces comparable outcomes. I would think it's harder when kids are very young, they're just not going to, it's going to be harder for them to engage, but maybe then it'll be more parent heavy or, but people have become very creative about the online environment with even kids.
It certainly, telehealth, I think there's a layer of flexibility there. And that, to me, also resonates with what you were asking a few minutes ago, Dan, about the busy life, whether it's a single parent household or a 2-parent household. I mean, folks are just busy, as you said. And if they have more than one child, a good provider leads with compassion and the ability to be flexible and individualized with the child and the family. When Jackie was talking about an approach that you might take if a child has separation anxiety, as she said, it's maybe not exactly like this. This is one way it could go. And, a good therapist will work with families to tweak treatment planning so that it works for them, and incorporate that flexibility that families might need to, make the demands of treatment and the asks of treatment work in their household and with their schedule and with their circumstances.
Right. Yes. And I'm glad you brought that out, that it's, I was trying to just sort of illustrate what it's like, but there's just a lot more nuance there and flexibility, as you said. And, a skilled therapist would be able to let the family lead on that angle. And you've got to really, when you're a therapist, right? You can't be pulling people along. So it's, it's a protocol, but you still have all the helping skills in there. To do the protocol effectively.
Right, we often talk about progress, not perfection. So
Definitely.
making those efforts counts and
Right.
accommodating along the way as we need to.
And I found actually with anxiety, I found like once people start to do the treatment and kind of the components that we talk about, they find success pretty fast. And so that's pretty reinforcing in itself. Like we're taking these small steps and everyone's just so thrilled when there's some small successes at the beginning, that it really seems to pick up steam among these families. So that I think, unlike some other problems, which are, I think, harder, long term to deal with, depending on the kind of person you are. But this one, I think you can make progress pretty well. Once you kind of get what's going on there, and people see success, and that in itself just kind of spirals.
So we talked about, especially about the behavioral component of CBT through exposure, but you had started to mention some factors that really tap into the cognitive piece, helping, asking the child about, kind of the biggest fear or worry or outcome. What are some other things that families might find that they're working with in terms of the cognitive piece of CBT? How do we help a child with that piece?
Well, there's a lot of nice materials out there now, but just talking about anxiety and the psychoeducation piece is the part of the cognitive piece. And this might be helpful for your man that you talked about, Dan. That then he would be in a session with his child and, she would have learned about kid-friendly way, depending on her age, of understanding anxiety and standing up to it, and what other metaphors have been used. And, she can explain it to him, so the psychoeducation is an important cognitive piece of just understanding what this is. It's not a child being attention seeking or, being whiny, just other sort of negative connotations that people may have. It's an actual thing that we can identify and we can treat. And there's probably a family history there anyway, somewhere that people can identify.
When I think about anxiety, and I think about, frankly, any problems along these lines. I always wonder, my analogy is this. Many people are hands-on type. They get in, they try and do something, build something, make something, create something, and then they learn by doing. Is helping your child with anxiety, or even helping yourself with anxiety, something where 50% of the people can make significant improvement by reading books, or do 70% of the people need a couple of sessions with a therapist, or what's the mix there?
I don't know if we have all that mapped out in the kind of the terms that you're asking, because I mean, probably each study addresses kind of a segment of that, you know. So I think we have some evidence that, you know, an anxiety type of workbook structure is helpful for some people. And, you know, we know our systems have to handle much more than they do now in terms of mental health prevention and treatment. And that's suggested sometimes as like a tier 1 approach, that once the person's identified with anxiety, you know, can they be given a workbook or an app or something that's been tested or is being tested, and that's how they can be treated. So I think these are questions that we don't really have answers for. I mean, I think, you know, I think like 2/3 of people might recover with, for anxiety with the CBT that we've been talking about, for instance.
That's actually kind of encouraging. It's actually very
It's very encouraging. Yeah. And like I pointed out before, though, just to be fair, you know, in comparison to other treatments, CBT often doesn't have the great impact that it has when there's no treatment at all. So just to be fair to other models that just haven't been researched as much. So
right.
I try to be critical of it.
In your previous answer, you were talking about systems. And when you talked about systems, were you really talking about schools? Are schools the first line of defense? Is the home the first line of defense? Is the school a part of that in terms of making sure that the child gets workbooks or gets diagnosed or whatever the case may be?
Well, I think it usually does come out in the home. I mean, I'm just generalizing, but just because these are kind of internalizing things, anxiety is, and so a child might hide it at school or avoid it at school. So I think the home is usually the first place that it's seen a lot, and sometimes kids are able to sort of hang together all day at school, and then when they get home, it's like, yeah, you know, everything comes out then. Just but you bring up the school. I don't think the school always has great accommodations for anxiety, because some of them inadvertently will give into this notion of, I have anxiety, therefore I need to leave the class now. And they're given, this is just anecdotal, what I've seen in my children's high schools is that, you know, people were given passes to leave when they felt anxious. And kind of the whole principle behind exposure is that you don't avoid, because avoidance is just a terrible cycle you can get into with anxiety and avoidance. So we want to face it one way or the other, even if it's just a little bit. So getting kids to leave is actually avoidance. And so it's like, oh, we don't want to do that actually. So like a more of an evidence-based thing would be, you know, being able to talk to the counselor between classes about how it's going, and or some little reward in between, or just something, you know, to keep them going to the next class. And so that's more of an evidence-based practice. But I don't know, Erica, you might see this more than I do right now about what the schools do with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we know is that schools' resources can vary a lot.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, in terms of space and human resources. But yeah, you mentioned, you know, children leaving the classroom, and often when I work with families, I'll talk about if children are stepping away from the classroom, we want to do that with the goal in mind that we want to get them back to the classroom, right? Mm-hmm. So they step away to recharge or take a breath, or, you know, whatever they find helpful during that time. We're doing that with the goal of getting back. You mentioned avoidance and some of the problems with avoidance, and I was wondering if you could speak about that a little bit more to help our listeners understand that cycle. What happens there when a person avoids the things that they're anxious about?
Yeah, it's just an extremely common pattern with anxiety of feeling just distressing emotions. And, we haven't really just talked about how painful it is to experience anxiety. Like, it's very distressing and people feel like they're going to die. And it's a horrible inner experience. So it's very torturous to have that experience. Now I've lost my train of thought since I was getting into such a deep thing there, but I did want to show you that it's not something to the avoidance. So it's extremely distressing. And so of course people want to get away from this feeling. Like, of course you would. It's very natural. But the only thing is that once you go away or don't go to that thing that's making you anxious, now your anxiety goes away and you feel wonderful. You feel such relief. And that is just really reinforcing right there. It's negative reinforcement. It's incredibly reinforcing. And so then there's a pattern, it starts pretty quickly because it felt so good when that anxiety finally went away and it was so horrible. So it's a very, very common pattern, and it just entrenches the whole anxiety more.
Yeah.
It keeps the ball rolling and rolling. So the treatment then is to slowly reverse that whole process.
Jackie, you mentioned how horrible it can feel to have anxiety. And when you say that, like, I can feel it. And then it makes me wonder, gosh, if my child has anxiety, is there any hope? Is there any, are there success stories? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there are very famous people with diagnosed anxiety. I think Adele, a singer, many people will know, has diagnosed anxiety. Megan Thee Stallion, if you're into rap, I believe, it's been said that she had diagnosed anxiety. And there are others. Another singer, Selena Gomez, no relation, has, or I believe has diagnosed anxiety. Even people that are comedians, Stephen Colbert has been said to have diagnosed anxiety. So it's not a death sentence. It may feel
No, not at all. Yeah, not at all. I didn't mean to convey that because, like I said before, it can be very successful, and I've seen a lot of success, and even some small steps that again lead to bigger things early on. So even though it can feel so terrible, recovery is possible for sure. I think there's just a lot of hope here when people get the right direction.
Yeah, I always think people are so surprised when they hear, as you said, Dan, about famous people who get up and perform in front of a lot of other people who live with anxiety. And, everyone's different, of course, but I certainly think that that's evidence that people can learn to thrive even with anxiety and do the things that are important to them. And a lot of times through treatment, right, that's what we're talking about. Now, we know for kids, like, for the most part, we're going to expect that kids go to school. That's like you have to. But other times in treatment, we're working with kids with, let's say social anxiety, where it's really uncomfortable to go to parties or other social situations, but they want to. And so we're helping them to be able to pursue something that they value, or performance anxiety related to a sport, and so they don't have to play baseball, but I like baseball. I want to play baseball. And I get anxious every time I get up to the plate and I freeze. So, through treatment, we can help people do the things that are important to them, the things that they need to do.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
You mentioned family history. So is anxiety genetic? I mean, does it just run through families? Is there clearly a pattern there, or what?
Run through families is rampant. It's what's called moderately heritable.
Okay.
Meaning it contributes in a moderate way. So it's not the end all and be all, but it usually, like other disorders, has a genetic component perhaps, and then there's environmental things that also happen that might set these risks off. So it's a complicated picture, but it usually involves both genetic and environmental factors. It's not usually due to one thing only.
So there's still hope. You can always blame your partner if that's the case.
Well, you still got to deal with it though, right?
Yeah. And I think that's so important. I think with so many human conditions or experiences, where there's a continuum, we want to know, right? How much of this is due to my genes and heredity, and how much of it is due to experience. And usually the answer is some, right, combination of both.
Yeah.
You may or may not be sure how much is heritable. And yet we still have to deal with it. Human beings vary in so many conditions and qualities, and certainly anxiety is one of them. We are coming back to this discussion that there are effective treatment approaches available for kids and their parents.
And I think just that tendency to want to know an answer, like, what is this because of? We have that tendency. And I think in some ways it's just to gain a little bit more control over whatever it is we're dealing with, right? If we have answers that we know are for sure, then we can deal with this thing and get our head around it. So I think sometimes that's just a way to, become just a little bit more in control. But it usually is more complicated, unfortunately.
We've talked today about the role of parents in multiple ways, the role that parents' own anxiety might play in the way they respond to their child, and most certainly the very important role that parents play in a child's treatment for anxiety. Something that I know comes up in a number of treatment approaches, including CBT, is the importance of modeling. And so that's really, kids look to the adults around them, especially their parents, for how to handle different situations and how to respond. And, sometimes parents may not realize, for better or worse, that we model how to handle our anxious feelings in situations that we're anxious about. And so I find that treatment can be really helpful with raising that awareness for parents too, that they can create opportunities to talk to their children about, I feel really anxious, or doing this thing or this activity makes me anxious. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to try this thing today. It may not go well, it may not go perfect, but we can model labeling our emotions and accepting them, including anxiety, and still, doing the things that are hard, and show that to our children.
Right. That, you can do these things, you can face them. I mean, sometimes you need to maybe talk to yourself in a different way, or, see the good thing that's going on and not being lost in negativity. I think sometimes, when we're around our children and we're used to just, saying the thoughts in our head, but you might be modeling a very negative approach to things, like, oh my goodness, I'm not going to be able to handle this. This is the worst thing ever. I don't know. And if you're saying those things aloud, it's like they're learning their self-talk by listening to you, right?
Yeah. How often do we do that as parents and then turn around and
Right.
say to our kid, like, go do that thing. That's not that hard.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, you gotta like catch yourself, going, okay, I gotta act the way I'm advising here. So it's a way to become, there's always opportunities for personal growth, right?
Mhm.
It's interesting, Jackie, you were talking about self-soothing from a child's perspective. I actually saw a child do that, where they repeated things that their parents had told them. And as they repeated it to themselves as if they were the parent. And it actually over time calmed, like in a short period of time, a couple minutes, actually calmed them down from their issue was, their anxiety or what have you. So that does work. I mean, I've literally seen it work. I wanted to ask you a couple of key questions, but before I do, You know, anxiety is a huge area, and in your book you talk a lot about not only ADHD and anxiety, but other disorders. Is there something else that you want to make sure that you bring up before we before we end up closing?
Well, just that, and we talked about this with the last disorder. It's not usually, or not often, just one disorder. You know, that a child with anxiety, you know, sometimes will have depression as well. So luckily, some of the treatments kind of address some of these same things, like the way a child is talking to themselves and a way to kind of soothe themselves. So, so I think I just want to, you know, make that point, is that usually, or sometimes you will have another disorder that can be diagnosed along with it. But that's okay. That's treatable too.
Okay. So let me ask you three quick questions. Just tell me, you know, off the top, what pops into your head. Number one, when should I ask for help?
Are you asking both of us?
No, I'm asking you, Jack.
Oh, okay.
When should I?
Well, I think, you know, I talked a bit about it earlier, of just the stage where it's not just a fleeting thing, it's something that's been around for a while, and it's really impacting the child's functioning at that age. And it's affecting the family or the household as well. So, you know, there's and the symptoms that they're showing, but all of that together, you know.
So I look at all of that together. I've now am suspicious. I'm not an expert, so I'm now suspicious that I need help. So I decide I want to call a therapist. Now, generally, when I think about calling a therapist, I think about the questions of what should I be asking before I even get there to make sure that I've got the right therapist. So I tend to try and select a therapist, whereas other people would say, oh, well, you know, you're licensed, you're a therapist, therefore I should be able to come to you. I'm not sure is necessarily in the case, but if it were you, what 2 or 3 questions would you ask a therapist for you to be comfortable that your child should go there?
Well, I mean, you know, I've been specific about cognitive behavioral therapy, so I would want someone who's been trained in that for children, and has been doing it for a bit, so that they have some level of experience.
Okay.
You know, often, I mean, insurance plays such a big role in this, though, you know, so it's navigating treatment is a whole nother subject. I mean, I think I have a whole chapter on it in the book, just because it's quite thorny at times, you know, and it's not that easy. So, you know, insurance has a huge role in this. Some people, of course, will only want to go to therapists that take their insurance. It depends on your area, but, you know, like I'm in the DC area, and, you know, a lot of people, most people don't take insurance at all, and they have really high rates, whereas in other parts of the country, that's not the case. So there's just so much variability on what's on offer. And then can you intersect your insurance with somebody who has been trained in this evidence-based model and has experience with it?
Okay.
So it's challenging, you know, I admit, I think it's a challenging landscape sometimes.
So before I'm ready to ask for help, there's the first thing I would want to do is I'd want to try and figure out what I can do. So short of therapy, what's 1 or 2 things I ought to try to help my child?
Well, I think having the talk, you know, bringing it out into the open, I think that's one. And then kind of seeing where things are, and maybe having more open lines of communication with your child. I mean, so, and there's books, there's an evidence-based book that it's with New Harbinger. It's not that recent, so but I listed in my book as something parents can use as their own manual for understanding this and for being able to help their child. So there are some self-help things for parents. And usually parents are going to be more motivated than kids are. So there's some great stuff out there now for teens as well. Some teens might be motivated, a lot of teens might not be, it would really depend, but often the parent is more motivated to get this straightened out. But there are resources out there.
I appreciate that. Your book actually did list a number of them. So not only your book, obviously, I would recommend, but your book actually recommends others. So that's good. It's always good to get the resource list. Before I ask each of you to summarize, and when I do, I'm going to start with you, Erica. But before I do, Jackie, you've written 18 books, hundreds of articles, or at least over 100 articles and book chapters and whatnot. You're a young woman. You must have 2 or 3 more books coming out. What's the next book?
Well, let's see. There's probably going to be a new edition of one of my mental health assessment books for social workers. That's probably going to be coming out with Oxford. Then with the Council on Social Work Press, I already have a book called What Do Social Workers Do All Day? And then it's first person essays by providers of work with different client populations and problems. And then there's going to be a second in the series, What Do Clinical Social Workers Do All Day? And hopefully providing just an array of cases from first person accounts of clinical social workers of different client problems and populations.
Cool.
So.
I'll be looking forward to it. As promised, I'd like to give each of you a minute to summarize. Erica, why don't we start with you?
So Jackie talked about this concept today that often comes up in CBT, the therapy that she recommended for children with anxiety of standing up to your anxiety. And I love that idea for both children and adults. And so for me in treatment, when I'm providing treatment with kids, I often tell them, we do not get to control the thoughts that our brain has. The thoughts, they come to us, right? But we do get to control how much they boss us around. And so we can stand up to our anxious thoughts and, whether that means telling them that thing that our anxiety is telling us is very unlikely to happen, or if it does happen, that we have the ability to handle it. So just like that idea of standing up to your anxiety, standing up to your just thoughts and doing, helping our kids to learn to do the things or to try the things that cause anxiety, so that they learn that they are capable and they have the capacity to do these things.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought out that point. Yeah.
Jackie, what about you?
Well, I would just want to say that, this is a treatable diagnosis. And one alarming statistic is that in adulthood, people report having gone 14 years median length of time without treatment for anxiety as adults. So we want to get in there, obviously, because some people will say, yeah, it started when I was a child or it started when I was a teenager. So it has been in their lives a long time. And so how much better would it be to get the treatment when someone is younger and not have that many years go by where, the anxiety bosses them around, So it is treatable. And so I would just encourage people, if this has resonated when it rises up to a clinical condition, to seek treatment because it is treatable. It probably won't be that for that long even. But it's I think you'll see results.
Well, I have to tell you, if I have anxiety or my child has anxiety, I certainly wouldn't want to wait 14 years, particularly if I could get them to be half as successful or even 1/4 as successful as Stephen Colbert or Selena Gomez or Megan Thee Stallion. So I'd be right there. I'd get treated every day if I could be 1/4 as successful as she is. Our sponsor today is Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services. It is an insurance-based provider whose mission is to help individuals achieve their personal potential and long-term growth by compassionately and respectfully helping clients live in balance. Visit equilibriapcs.com, equilibriapcs.com. You can look for them on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can also look for me on Instagram, Daniel J. Gomez 24, and on LinkedIn. Now for the disclaimer. I am not a medical professional, and I am not providing medical advice. The opinion of our speakers is solely their own. This podcast is copyrighted and cannot be reproduced without the express written consent of EPCS Management, LLC.